Hello everybody, welcome back. We are in our video series on supply and demand for macroeconomics, still working on the mechanics of supply and demand and then ultimately applying these ideas toward macroeconomic phenomenon. So in the last video we looked at demand. In this video we're going to look at supply, and in the next video we're going to put them together so we have the whole market, supply and demand, and talk about equilibrium. So let's dive in and talk about supply. On the supply side, we're talking about the sellers. And so our definition for the quantity supplied, which I abbreviate with QS, is the amount of a good that sellers are willing and able to sell. The amount of a good that sellers are willing and able to sell. And then we'll put at a given price. Okay, so when we talk about supply, we're talking about the entire supply curve. When we're talking about quantity supplied, we're talking about some quantity at a given price. We'll look at that some more later as well. But again, we are talking about the sellers, and just like with the demand side, this has to be both willing and able. And our law of supply is a claim, or the claim, let's say, the claim that the quantity supplied of a good increases when the price of a good rises, all else equal. So the claim that the quantity supplied of a good rises when the price of the good rises. When the price of the good rises. And again, all else equal, or ceteris paribus. Okay, so demand curve was downward sloping. What this is saying is that the supply curve is going to be upward sloping. Right, and it also makes sense. If prices increase, that's going to have greater profit opportunities for sellers. It's going to make it more likely that sellers are going to be able to cover their costs when they sell the output. So if the price goes up, more sellers are going to be willing to sell, and the sellers already in the market are going to be willing to sell more. Okay, so we can see this with a supply schedule, which is just a table between price and quantity. That's what we have over here on the left, and then we use our supply schedule to create the supply curve. Okay, so again, here we're just going to plot these out like we did on the demand curve. At a price of 0, this is one seller. Using an example of Starbucks, at a price of 0, they're not willing to supply any lattes. At a price of 1, it goes up to 3, so on and so forth, up to 30. So this is just going to follow along there to create a supply curve for a single seller. But again, when we're talking about supply and demand in markets, we want competitive markets. So we want many sellers. We're going to look at the price and aggregate the quantity supplied over many sellers to see this market supply curve and show that it also obeys the law of supply. And as the price changes, we move along the curve to look at the quantity supplied. So here we had another coffee shop. In reality, we have loads of coffee shops, and we just aggregate at each price. We add up the quantities. Here it's going up by 5s, 25, 30, and we can just plot that as well, and that's going to finish up at the top for the market supply curve. Okay, upward sloping. As the price increases, the quantity increases, all else equal. That behaves according to the law of supply. Okay, so again, just as with demand and looking at demand curve shifters, we're going to look at supply curve shifters when everything else is not equal, the non-price determinants of supply, these are going to shift the entire curve. Okay, so again, maybe pause the video for a second. Think about if you're a seller or if you're thinking about sellers or the whole entire market supply, what might affect, other than the price of goods, the supply in the marketplace. So think about that for a second. Pause if you need to, and I'll briefly discuss those here. So the first one is going to be the input prices. Here we're thinking about raw materials or labor or intermediate goods, pieces and parts that are required to make the product. If we're talking about the market for coffee, this could be the price of coffee beans or the price of the cups, the to-go cups to put them in. Everything, the cost of doing business. Okay, second one is technology, which is going to ultimately be very similar to input prices because improvements in technology reduce the cost of inputs. Number of sellers is our third. And finally, again, we have expectations. So let's go through these. Starting with input prices. Examples of input prices, like I said, raw materials, but also things like wages, things like the rent in the building if the company doesn't own it, or the mortgage to pay the bank if the company does own the building, but not outright. And so anything, again, cost of doing business. So anything that makes any fall in the input prices, anything that makes production more profitable, it's going to increase the supply. So if you can make more money because your cost of doing business has gone down, you're going to be more willing to increase the supply. And again, that's happening at every single price. So the quantity supplied increases at every single price point, and as a result, it shifts the entire supply curve. Technology does the same thing. Basically, it determines the inputs required, and if you have some cost-saving technology, it's easier to do business. We shift the supply curve again to the right. And let me emphasize that when there's an increase in supply, we want to shift the curve to the right. You don't want to shift the curve upward. Let me show you that in red to show you why. If instead of shifting to the right, you shifted upward, that's going to result in a supply curve where the quantity supplied are actually going down. And so this upward increase in the supply curve is not what you'd want to be doing. It would actually give you the exact opposite result of what you're looking for. So these increases shift to the right, decreases, supply decrease, shift to the left. That's kind of the best way to think about it, in my opinion. Okay, so that's technology and input prices, same thing. Anything that makes it easier to do business, you increase that supply. Next one is the number of sellers. Just generally speaking, if you have more businesses selling things, the supply increases. So if you've got 5 coffee shops in town and then 3 more open up, the supply of coffee has gone up. So you shift the supply curve to the right. And finally, expectations. Let's take an example here. Suppose that some events in the Middle East lead to expectations of higher oil prices. How do those expectations about the oil prices affect the demand for oil now? Or not the demand, the supply for oil now. In response, it could be that people who have the ability and the capacity to store their oil, they reduce the supply now, waiting for that expected price rise to come up in the future, so that once the prices do increase, then they can release their product into the market at a higher price and make a higher profit. So expectations about better prices in the future could decrease the supply today. Okay, so that's a decrease in supply shifts to the left. Okay, so caveat here, just generally speaking, this is only true if the goods are perishable, not perishable. You also have holding costs. If you think the prices of bananas are going to go up in 6 months, you're not going to hoard a whole bunch of bananas today. Yeah, it just kind of depends on the market you're talking about, and just kind of use your best judgment on that. Okay, so that was number of sellers and the expectations. So that's actually it for the supply curve as well. So supply curve shifters, demand curve shifters, these are really important. We're going to take these and then put them together to start talking about equilibrium in the next video.